So I like to start my talks with this picture, but it's particularly relevant for this morning's discussion because it shows the importance of the intergenerational relationships between this grandmother and her grandchild. And so what I'd like to do today, even though it says 2 parts in your program, I'm going to talk about 4 different things this morning, and we'll take that 5-minute break after the part 2 here. I'd like to say a few words of background about aging and autism, and then talk substantively about how what the family's role is in achieving positive outcomes for their son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter with an autism spectrum diagnosis as they move through adolescence, adulthood, and into midlife. And then after our 5-minute break, we'll talk about the reciprocal influence, about how the son or daughter may influence the members of the family. And I use the word child here without quotes, but meaning quotes, because as grandparents know about their adult children, they're still their children even if they're not young people anymore. And the same is true for when I say reciprocal child-parent influences. I'm talking about the adolescent and adult child and what their influences are on the parents and beyond. And lastly, talk about a successful transition to quality of life in adulthood. And I hope we get through all of this. If not, we'll do our best to keep mindful of the time. So starting with some background on aging and autism. And so these are 3 of the dozens and dozens of images that we see in the popular media of autism. And in general, these are exclusive or almost exclusively focused on early childhood images. And children are often portrayed, or generally portrayed alone, not with family members around them. So things are changing. The fact that we're focusing today's discussion on people with autism spectrum disorders in adolescence and adulthood is an indication that things are changing. And I think there's increasing focus on not only autism spectrum disorders during adulthood, but also how the family context affects and is affected by having a son or daughter with this diagnosis. And one can attribute this change to, this is, I'm not the person who coined this phrase, but this concept of a diagnostic boom that started around 1990. I know the little bars are small and the years below them are smaller, but that arrow tells you that that's around 1990. And every year since 1990, the rate of diagnosis has gone up exponentially. And those children who were diagnosed in 1990 are now young adults exiting the school system, beginning to confront the world of adulthood, and their families are dealing with this as well. So I think that has prompted the change that brought us here today. Also in the year 2000, in the beginning of the year 2010, in the beginning of 2010, the NIH Interagency Coordinating Council on Autism posed a new question, because they pose these questions and they direct their grant funding based on these questions. And this is question 6, pulled out of their report, and what does the future hold, particularly for adults? And they're talking about adults on the spectrum. And they talk about the need for studies of the scope and impact of the spectrum of autism in adults, including critical life transitions, and the need for longitudinal studies that follow carefully characterized cohorts, little alliteration there, and their families into adulthood to understand the risk and protective factors that account for quality of life outcomes. And when I read this, I had to say, I thought, well, that's what we've been doing for the previous 10 years, because our research on adolescents and adults with autism started in 1998. Not that there isn't the need for more of this research, but it was, I'm glad that the NIH has recognized this in a formal way as a priority for future research. So going back to the beginning of time in the field of autism, Dr. Lee O'Connor published the first paper on what he called autistic disturbances of affective contact in 1943. And this was a study of 8 boys and 3 girls, these 11 children who averaged age 8 in 1943 when he published his paper. And it's a remarkable journal paper to read, and if you have the opportunity to do so, I would recommend it. There are aspects of it that are disturbing, and I'll come to that in a second, but also really good clinical descriptions of children who beforehand had not been brought together by any clinician, and he had the insight to say they have characteristics in common, and he gave this condition or these characteristics a name. Those 11 children are today would be 77 years of age if they were all still alive. And many of them are still alive. And there is a study that is recontacting Dr. Connor's first cohort of 11 children and seeing how they, what their life has been like. And in last September's, a year ago September's Atlantic Monthly, the magazine, there was an article written about Dr. Connor's first case, whose name is Donald Gray Triplett, and he was 77 years of age when that magazine article was published, and it talked about his life. And his life was it was a very privileged life, and he had a good quality of life. And again, I would recommend, for those of you who haven't read this article, you can Google it and get it easily online, and it's a very interesting notion that this is the first person who was ever written about in the medical literature as having this diagnosis that is so common today, and what his life was like as it unfolded. But when we think about today's older adults with autism, their lives were very, very different than the lives of the children that that we're working with today. And these older adults were generally not correctly diagnosed when they were children. I mean, only 11 people had that diagnosis in 1943. So there were thousands and thousands of people who would have met the same criteria who did not have the proper diagnosis. They didn't benefit from any of the federal legislation that I don't say we take for granted today, but that we consider an entitlement today. Early intervention, the IDEA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, none of that existed, of course. These individuals, these older adults, people who are today in their 50s and 60s and 70s who have autism, whether diagnosed or not, they grew up without the benefit of public education. There was societal ignorance, and for those who knew anything about autism, there was societal misunderstanding. And very little was known about how the family context could facilitate optimal adult development. And so this is a generation of older people today who really don't have any of the advantages that we think about for young people who have a diagnosis on the spectrum. So this is back to that original article, and one of the really damaging parts of this article was the blaming of the family that came out of this paper, where Dr. Connor, although he made wonderful clinical observations about the children, he made incorrect inferences about the family. And basically he was questioning whether the family was the cause for the children's condition. And he and his successors not only blamed the family, but coined the phrase refrigerator mothers, and they thought they understood what we now know is not a condition that's caused by parenting, but rather a condition with not well understood, but very likely biological underpinnings. And this was a complete detour that the field took for many, many years, for decades, because the professionals eventually realized that this was an incorrect characterization, but there was a reluctance to study the family because of this initial mischaracterization. So that's when we came along and we decided, wait a minute, this is a good opportunity. We should be embracing the study of the family context of autism and autism spectrum disorders. And so we began our longitudinal study, which is the Adolescents and Adults with Autism Study, AAA. And we began that in 1998, and we've had funding from the National Institute on Aging that will officially end later this year, but we have a no-cost extension, so we will go till 2013 for our current funding. And what we do in this study is we take repeated measures of the mother and occasionally the father and occasionally siblings and the adolescents or adult on the spectrum. The mother is sort of the linchpin of this study. And our overall goal is to investigate how autism changes, how the behavioral phenotype of autism changes during adolescence and adulthood, and then reciprocally the influence of these changes on the family. So we recruited a large sample of the families of over 400 individuals in 2 states, in Massachusetts and Wisconsin. And at the beginning of our study, time 1, which was in 1998, the individuals on the spectrum were as young as 10, and the oldest one was 52 years of age. So one of the early generation of people diagnosed. And when you think about where they are today, 12 years later, you could think of what the age range is. And these are families who are extraordinarily generous with us, who continue to participate. over 2/3 of them are participating currently, and that means that every 18 months or so we visit with them. We spend several hours in the home. They have told us, they have shared, and we have learned an enormous amount from what the families have told us. And we have watched these families go through the transitions of life, through people developing health problems, some of the families passing away, mothers or fathers passing away, of siblings moving back to be close to the family or moving further away. And so that the families really are an enormous reservoir of expertise that we draw upon as I'll show you some of our findings for today. I just want to point out that 2/3 of our sample members are adolescents, were adolescents when the study began. Adolescents broadly defined as age 10 to 21. So we were able to study with a large cohort what happens when people leave high school, which is really one of the important things that I'll share with you later on. Also, almost 40% were adults, and that's important because there was so little known about adults with autism, and we have been able to track the quality of life and the changes that they've experienced during adulthood. So specifically, we look at change in autism symptoms over this more than a decade period, change in behavior problems, change in activities of daily living, of functional skills, and I'll be showing you some new data that we have in that regard. We are interested in life course turning points, particularly leaving high school, but there are other turning points that we investigate, such as moving out of the family home. And we're also interested in the reciprocal effects, as I mentioned, how the son or daughter with the disability affects the family. And we collect data on the biomarkers of the impact of lifelong parenting from mothers. And I'll be showing you a little bit of data from all of those points during the rest of our morning. I'll show you this slide a lot of times. I hope it's not so many times that you're irritated by it, but I wanted to just show you the unfolding of our study. So time one was started in 1998 when we began our research, and 18 months later was time two, and all of the sort of turquoise boxes are separated by 18 months, time one to time two to time three, et cetera. And then after time four, we took a break and we did a different aspect of our study, which I'll tell you about, our daily diary and cortisol study. And then we went back to our current round of data collection, visiting the family every 18 months, interviewing the mother, collecting some additional data. And we are now in the field for time 8, which is the last point of our currently funded study. And we just were fortunate enough to get an Autism Speaks grant to have time 9 follow. So we're going to have to redo this slide at some point. But I wanted you to see how this unfolds, and various studies that I'll be reporting to you pull data from different time points. But what we're able to do is to sort out the order of events. We can't really know what's cause in a sort of fundamental proof way, but we're able to look at the time ordering of events as they unfold in the family and in the individual with the autism diagnosis, and that helps strengthen our inferences of what comes first. So just to tell you a little bit about the sample members before we plunge into the data, the average age of the son or daughter with autism was 22 when our study began, and the average age of the mother was 51. We have a lot of focus on the mother, and part of that is because our funding comes from the National Institute on Aging, and they're interested in how caregiving affects family members who provide care. About 3/4 of the sample members with the autism diagnosis are male. About 2/3 were living at home when our study began. About 3/4 were verbal. In other words, they could use phrases of 3 words or more in everyday speech. 95% had autistic disorder. So this is not a study, with a few exceptions, of people who had Asperger's or PDD and OS. But all of that is going away, as we now know. But all of these, 95% of them qualified for a diagnosis of autistic disorder. And this was not a super affluent sample and not a sample of families living in poverty, but the average income was about $50,000 in 1998. So here's a little bit about the comorbidities of the sons and daughters, the probands with the autism diagnosis. About 70% had intellectual disability, meaning an IQ of about 70 or below. Nearly 1/4 had seizures, and half of them had an additional diagnosis, an additional mental health diagnosis. And you could see the numbers up there about what's the most prevalent, the anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, and depression. But fewer have severe mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. About 3/4 take prescription medications. 15 of our sample members take 5 different prescription medications. And of those who are taking medications, the average number of medications is about nearly 3. And about more than 1/3 of the sample take anticonvulsants, even though not all of those people have seizures. And about a little bit fewer take antidepressants, and some take antipsychotics, even though many fewer have a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder. So this is a heavily medicated population, and I'm not saying that in a pejorative sense, but this, when we think about aging with autism, this is aging with a heavy dose of psychotropic medications.